Thank you for joining us today for a discussion of World War One. This was, at the time, called the Great War. It was the first war that multiple countries around the world fought. Think about that for a minute. What would it mean instead of having one or two countries, maybe three or four countries fighting each other, for tens of countries on each side fighting each other? What would that mean when the conflict occurs not just in one part of the globe, but even spills over to other parts? That's what made World War One unique from any other war before. There are often four causes that are distilled down for reasons for World War One. First one of them is nationalism. We also have imperialism, militarism, and alliances. Let's explore each of those a little more in depth. Nationalism. Nationalism is when someone is intensely devoted to their own nation and maybe even more importantly, the people of their nation, their ethnic group. This goes beyond patriotism. This isn't just rooting for your team in the Olympics. This is rooting against other countries and beginning to demonize other countries because people who were intensely nationalistic saw their nation, their people, their ethnic group maybe as better than others. And in the case when that ethnic group or that group of people was ruled by someone else, a real desire to break away from that. Another cause is imperialism. We talked about imperialism in depth a few weeks ago. But just think when nations are competing around the world with each other, that's just going to allow one more area for a spark to set off a larger conflict. We also have militarism because of industrial improvements, new technologies of the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Nations around the world have not only bigger militaries that they've built up for imperialist expansion, but now they have new weaponry that some people actually feel anxious to try out during a time of war. But again, that competition of, one country flexing on another is going to make it more likely that something spills out of control. And then finally, we have our system of alliances. Alliances are what will really make what could have been a small war between just two nations become the Great War. This list is much longer, but we'll shorten it right now to just a few nations on each side. So, with the Triple Entente or the Allied powers, there's Great Britain, France, and Russia. We also have on the other side the Central Powers: Germany, Austria Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Italy starts out on the Central Powers. It won't really fight for them. In fact, it'll switch just a year into the war to the other side. If you want to kind of do a little extra research, something that's really interesting is the fact that I believe four of these heads of states from these countries were actually cousins. So you have cousins fighting each other, but of course, with Europe's systems of marriages, intermarriages, trying to keep things in families, but then also expand families for political reasons. It's kind of unique that you have these family members that will be fighting each other. So the war starts with an assassination, and this is the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, Austria-Hungary was expanding its own reach, and it had power in Bosnia, in the Balkans, and southeastern Europe. And the Archduke is visiting his his realm, if you want to call it that. And there is a Bosnian or Serbian nationalist who is going to try to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It's actually kind of an interesting story. He is driving through, and the first attack on him is actually a bombing. Someone throws a bomb, but the bomb detonates, doesn't hit the Archduke's car, but it injures a lot of bystanders. So the Archduke decides later on he's fine. He wants to go visit some of the people who were assassinated. Excuse me, who were targeted in the assassination. Some of the innocent bystanders. Later on, however, his driver, who there's no Google Maps, there's no Waze. His driver is driving to their next point, and he turns down a street. Well, the street he turns down is where the would-be assassin from earlier just happens to be kind of hanging out, trying to figure out what went wrong with his plot. So he takes his pistol, walks up, and shoots Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, the system of alliances is what's really going to, like we said, make this a global war. It's obscured in this image, but we have Serbia, which is where the assassin was from, and Austria-Hungary, of course, declares war on Serbia. Right? You killed our heir to the throne, so Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. What could have just been an Austrian-Serbian war, of course, becomes something much longer. Germany, who was allies with Austria-Hungary, declares war on Russia because Russia was Serbia's ally. France is also Russia's ally, so now Germany declares war on France. Britain, who was allies with France and Russia, declares war on Germany. And of course, through all of these, right, the power who was declared upon then declares war back. So we're not going to convolute things with arrows going both ways, but we now have Britain declaring war on Germany. Austria-Hungary, Germany's ally, declares war on Russia. Britain declares war on Austria-Hungary. France declares war on Austria-Hungary. And finally, Russia and Serbia together declare war on the Ottoman Empire, who were allies with Germany and Austria-Hungary. So you can quickly see how this becomes one huge conflagration when it otherwise might have just been a war between two nations. This map shows the lines during World War I. We'll pause there just for a second if you want to take a look at it. Again, we see the Triple Entente in purple, and we see the Central Powers in the gold color. The green nations are neutral. And we'll talk now just a little bit about the beginning of the war. We won't get into detail on too many battles. Most college classes don't ask about who won which battle, unless maybe it's a turning point, but just wanted to pause here so that you can take a brief look at it. So the war begins, and it's unique. Everybody thinks this war will last just a few months. There are people in England who sign up and they say, oh, this will be a great adventure. It'll be kind of like not quite going away to camp, but the war starts summertime, and all these people are saying, we'll be home by Christmas. So they sign up thinking, we'll go, we'll train, we'll shoot a few guns, and we'll be home in just a few months. That's not the case, however. This war will last for 4 years. Germany's plan, because it was fighting on two fronts, as we saw on the last map, was called the Schlieffen Plan. And what they did was, because they had opponents on both sides, they decided to hold most of their fighting against Russia on their east until later on. So Germany is going to concentrate 80% of its troops on its western front. And they'll hope to quickly overtake France, take possession, and then shift their troops to the east to fight Russia. They have an early success in Belgium. They kind of roll through Belgium on their way into France, but France quickly digs in and halts the German advance. Both sides will dig trenches, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and that means that the war on the Western Front is going to pretty much stay exactly the same for the 4 years of the war. Germany will then turn its attention to its eastern flank. Some key theaters of the war, like we said, the Western Front, trench warfare, very little movement. The East, there were battles where territories would often change hands, quickly changing hands, and maybe change right back. The other key theater of the war is at sea, and we have naval warfare for the first time. There are submarines. Submarines were famously called by the Germans U-boats, which stood for Unterseeboats, undersea boats. Literally, what they are, right? Submarine, a boat that goes under the water. This submarine warfare will have lasting effects. It's one of the reasons why the United States will come into the war, as we'll see in a little bit. Now, like we said with trench warfare, both sides dig in, they dig deep trenches, and that means that it's very difficult to move forward because you have these parallel systems of trenches on both sides. In between is no man's land. It might be 100 yards long, it might be a half mile across. And think about it, are you really going to want to come up out of the trench and then run across maybe a quarter mile, a half mile of land? You'll easily be shot and picked off during that, right? So this fighting is inconclusive. Aside from that, the conditions are filthy. In the trenches, there will be something called trench foot, which develops. These trenches, there's no drainage. There's often standing water. There are huge rats. Disease easily spreads from contaminated water. People who are living with continuously wet feet that never dry out, wet socks, wet boots, develop trench foot, which, if you want to maybe ruin your appetite, you can easily look up images of that. But they're just horrid conditions. And again, not much really changes. There's a great book, All Quiet on the Western Front, if you really want to check it out and see what life was like in the trenches. The picture on the left, it's a little hard to see, but that's an aerial photo. Those are showing the trenches from an airplane that shows it's not just one line, that there's an entire system of lines. There are often supply lines in the back, headquarters, medical facilities in the back, but you just have multiple trenches. And you can really get an idea from this image of why movement was so slow to happen. Besides submarines, there's other new technology that's used for the first time or to large effect during this war. The first is poison gas, mustard gas, chemical weapons. These are used for the first time, and they're horrific. People are blinded. They're killed from within as their lungs burn from the inside. You have the use of gas masks, as you can see in the image for the first time. We have tanks. Tanks will be the one thing that kind of changes the war in the trenches, as tanks, of course, are more impervious to rifle fire than a person running across a trench. But we do have tanks. We saw the aerial image, so airplanes will be used for the first time. It's kind of unique in that we get early dogfights. And if you see these early dogfights, maybe you never thought about it, but you see the pilot with the machine gun right in front of him, right? Well, in front of that is the propeller. So how do you fire that without shooting your own propeller? And it's a unique bit of engineering, but those propellers were timed. Think how fast they're moving, but there was a syncopation between the firing of the bullets and when the propeller would go through, so that the pilot would not wind up shooting himself. And like we said, machine guns. Repeating rifles and guns like that had existed before, but they're not really used until this time with devastating effect. Throughout all of this, the United States is neutral. We didn't see them in the list of allies at the beginning, but the United States will eventually come into the war. And one of the things that starts leaning the US towards getting involved was the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a British passenger ship. It wasn't a cargo ship, it wasn't a military ship, but it was a passenger ship returning from the US to Great Britain. and German U-boats sink it, and there are lots of Americans on the ship. So, of course, America had been saying, right, we were neutral at the beginning of the war. We didn't want to get involved. We wanted to remain isolationist. But this death of many Americans will kind of lead Americans to start to maybe want to take a side, whereas before Americans just wanted to stay out of it. Another thing that changes the desire for American involvement is the Zimmerman note. So you can see at the bottom the coded message and then the translation up top. But the Zimmerman note was a proposal. It was never accepted, but it was a proposal by Germany to Mexico. And what Germany was saying was, hey, Mexico, remember all that land you lost in the US Mexican War? All that land you lost in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848? California, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah. Hey, Mexico, you know what? If you declare war on the United States, we, Germany, will help you out, and perhaps you can get that territory back. So, this is a proposal that Germany makes. It's intercepted by the British, who turn it over to the Americans. Like, hey, look what Germany is trying to do. They're trying to start a war in your own backyard. That way, America won't get involved, or if they're involved, they won't have the ability to send troops to Europe, right? Because we'll be fighting in our own Southwest. So again, once this plan is revealed to the world, many Americans start to think, oh, look what Germany's trying to do behind our back. And this again leads to a desire to go to war. So Woodrow Wilson, he had been elected in 1912, and for the second half of his first term, from 1914 to 15, even into 16, he's saying he kept us out of war. That's one of his big campaign slogans. That war, it's over there. We don't need to get involved. That's Europe's issue. However, as soon as he gets elected, like we saw, there were things that were leaning toward America getting involved, and he will wind up declaring war in April of 1917. So right after his inauguration, he comes into the war. And he says that we need to go to war to make the world safe for democracy. That's the big quote to know, to make the world safe for democracy. He didn't want a totalitarian regime, right? The German Kaiser, the Austrian, Hungarian ruler. He didn't want them ruling Europe. He was saying that we needed to protect France, which had a democracy, the UK, which had a constitutional monarchy, right? The US needed to fight to protect that. So what do we get for the first time? For the first time since the Civil War, we have a draft instituted in the United States. And selective service, we still have that system today, but men had to register for the draft, and about 3 million men wind up being called. We went from a very small army that was not very experienced to one that quickly had 3 million new recruits and had to be trained up very quickly. On the home front, you'll see this in some of your poster assignments, but on the home front, there's a real focus on the war effort. And there's a shift from making consumer goods to wartime goods. There's a saying, it's called guns versus butter, that economists, economic historians often use, right? Do you want to spend your money as a nation making guns, military supplies, or butter, the more, maybe not luxuries, but consumer goods that we all tend to appreciate. So there's a shift from one to the other. We have rationing of consumer products where there are limits placed on what you can buy. And we'll see on the next slide, we also have women going to work in places that had traditionally not been open to women. All of these things are kind of a preview for World War II. They'll be replicated to an even greater extent because the US was much more involved in World War II for a greater amount of time. During this time, there was an anti-immigrant hysteria, particularly against German immigrants or even German culture. German Americans face suspicion. Newly arrived German immigrants face physical attack. They may be laid off of work. Orchestras around the nation banned the playing of classical music written by Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, German artists. Towns that had German sounding names or German names changed their names. Libraries banned books by German authors. And we talked about during the Progressive Era, right? There was the movement for prohibition. Well, one of the reasons that prohibition was fought for was to target beer as a German drink. So all of these things kind of show what's happening at the home front in this anti-German hysteria. Like we said earlier, women are going to go to work in areas that had not really been open to them before. So it's kind of unique. Women are still waiting on suffrage. We know that that won't happen until 1920. Here they are helping a war for democracy when they can't even participate in our American democracy. Women work in factories, like we said. This picture is an image of working women in a munitions factory, so making shells. And then we also had women working telephone lines. Telephones back then, you might have seen in old movies, there's a switchboard where you picked up the phone and someone would physically move cables to connect you to a different exchange where somebody is connecting that cable to someone else. So there was this relay system of cables, and women went to Europe just behind the front lines running some of these switchboards. So just a few of the ways that women contributed to the war effort, both at home and overseas during World War I. The big American general to know is General John J. Pershing. Pershing was the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, and he really trains up America quickly. Those 3 million troops were just a few weeks before working as farmers, working in factories, as carpenters. So he is not the only one, but someone who quickly trains Americans' forces to be ready to fight and make sure that we can fight as our own independent force and not simply be absorbed into the British Army or the French Army. He'll play a key victory at different battles as well. But he's kind of one of the names that you need to know. It's kind of funny. It's the same time as America is coming into the war, Russia is leaving. So Russia had been ruled for quite a while by the Romanovs, and the ruler was Tsar Nicholas II. But there was a lot of uproar against Tsar Nicholas. People saw him as abusive, as taking money from Russian peasants. There was a huge dichotomy between the wealthy and the poor in Russia. And so he will abdicate his throne. He'll be forced to abdicate in March of 1917. Later on that year, one of the groups that were pushing for change were the Bolsheviks. So the communists will take over. When they take over, they will negotiate for Russia to leave World War I. Russia will actually lose some of their land as terms for leaving World War I. And that'll be one of the problems at the end of the war, which contributes to maybe the beginning of the Second War. The war will end just a year after America enters in 1918. Things end fairly rapidly. On November 3rd, Austria-Hungary surrenders. One of the big powers is out of the war. And pretty much at the same time, there's a rebellion of German military members. By November 9th, the Kaiser, the leader of Germany himself, abdicates the throne. And 2 days later, the new government or the new people in charge of Germany sign an armistice. And this armistice will take effect on, they negotiated the day before, but it will take effect on November 11th at 11 a.m. So there's a saying that's often you may have heard, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. That's today, the day that we celebrate Veterans Day, November 11th. It was started out as Commemoration Day for those killed in World War One, but of course today Veterans Day has come to encompass anybody who has served our nation in the armed forces. The treaty. The Treaty of Versailles is what will end World War One. It has some successes, but it also has a lot of failures. First off, 9 new nations will be created as a result of this treaty. The German Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, all of those nations or all of those empires are broken up and we get new nations. Russia will also lose some of its land as it withdrew from the war the year before. So we have 9 new nations that are created. Germany is barred from having its own army. So there will no longer be a standing German army. It was illegal. Germany is also forced to accept guilt for starting the war, which, if you think about it, Germany really didn't start the war, right? It was a Serbian assassinating an Austrian, and it was Austria who first declared war on Serbia. But that didn't matter. Germany was forced to accept a war guilt clause, and they had to pay reparations, a penalty, a payment for starting the war, according to the treaty. Those reparations took 92 years to be paid off. So if you think about it, that's a long, long time. And more important, or just as important as how wars begin, is how they end. And unfortunately, the ending of World War One will directly relate to the beginning of World War Two. Germany was humiliated by having to accept this, right? The blame for this war. They themselves feel bad about losing the war, right? The reparations were too costly. Germany will be in a depressed economic state from 1918 really into the 1930s when Hitler comes to power and starts building up their military again, which of course was against the Treaty of Versailles. This land's also going to take away territory from Germany and from Russia. It's going to make both sides antsy, maybe, to recover some of their land. So, in an attempt to make things better than they were, Wilson will offer 14 points, his plan for peace, and they're called Wilson's 14 points. Among them, Wilson says that there's the need for self-determination around the world. He's really a fan of democracy, right? The whole reason he said the US entered was to make the world safe for democracy. Well, now he's putting forth a plan to make that happen. He thought that nations and that ethnic groups should have territorial integrity. They should be entitled to their own land and it should be protected. He wanted to promote democracy, like we said, around the world. He wanted to reduce the number of arms. He thought, having all these weapons building up, stockpiling, is probably going to make countries more likely to use them. So if there could be a worldwide reduction in arms, that would be successful. And most importantly, his 14th point called for a League of Nations. He says, you know what? The idea is if all the nations of the world can get together and talk about their problems when they're small, that will prevent them from getting big and becoming something like another great war. So his 14th point, the League of Nations, that's what he really held strong to. But the U.S. never ratified the treaty. Congress, the Senate, has to approve treaties, and they never did. The U.S. never joined. So you might think, why? It kind of makes sense, right? For nations of the world to get together and talk. But there was this growing movement toward isolationism in the United States at the time. And so a lot of Americans, after having fought in this war only for a year, but still putting forth a lot of effort, are wanting to withdraw from world affairs. Congress was also afraid of giving away some American power. They'll say, what happens if this League of Nations decides to do something? Can the US be compelled to follow it? So that's another reason why the United States doesn't join. But that move to isolationism will continue as we go into the 1920s. And then, of course, we'll be preoccupied with other economic disasters that will keep us pretty much focused on ourselves. Well, unfortunately, we'll have a rise to power in the 1930s of totalitarian regimes in Europe again. Thank you for watching. This video was created by me. Thank you to the sources listed for the images, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.